Well, ladies and gents, welcome to our last panel of the day before closing comments from Mr. Ely. I'd like to start out by once again thanking our sponsors so much for helping to facilitate these kind of events. Again, Airbus, Boeing, MITRE, RAA, and A4A. Please join me in thanking one more time. Okay, so now that we're at our final panel, this one's going to be a little bit different, a bit of a curveball to end the day on a course change. So far, we've been talking about predictive, proactive, prospective programs that really look for precursors. It seems like everything beginning with PR is what we've been talking about almost all day long. But what about the flip side? What about reactive use of data? And how is this different from, or sometimes the same as, all the other uses? Captain Nick Seemel and his panel are going to discuss those differences and similarities, especially when it comes to reacting to safety data, reacting to accident data, and how to use that data to its highest purpose. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, folks. First off, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this. Clearly, we have to have this conversation as often as possible to facilitate real change in these areas. And I think it's fitting that the last presentation, the last panel is investigations, because no matter how proactive we are, inevitably there's going to be situations that we have to investigate, both internally in the company and at the safety board level. So my panel today, Captain Brian Crawford, Director of Safety and Regulatory Compliance at ExpressJet, Ms. Dana Schulze, Deputy Director, Office of Aviation Safety at the National Transportation Safety Board, an old friend, Captain Terry McVenes, Director of System Safety and Regulatory Affairs at Boeing, Jeffrey Duven, FAA Manager, Transport Airplane Director, Aircraft Certification Service, and to wrap it up at the end, Captain Chuck Hogeman, who's been busy all day today, Aviation Safety Chair at the Airline Pilots Association International. Fun fact about this committee, I was talking to Chuck last night. There's 3 people on this committee. We're all Americans, and we all have British Aerospace 146 endorsements. The smallest 4-engine jet in the world. Anyway, today we've looked at many aspects of the proactive safety work, and now this panel will help us explore the changing role of investigations in the safety risk management evolution. My background working as an ALPA volunteer started with the old school struggle that is still out there in the minds of some regulators and airlines. Not all that long ago, when I would advise my pilots how to behave during an investigation, it was guarded and protectionist. It had to be. All too often it seemed that during a safety investigation, the individual was sought out by the regulator specifically for non-compliance with no real consideration for context. And little help came from their employer, as the employer also sought out the individual to blame. While the safety board typically did in-depth investigations and put the occurrence in context, many of us think that they coined the overused phrase, pilot error. So with that in mind, as we move forward, the ongoing evolution of full voluntary disclosure and data collection gives us great opportunities to do real safety risk investigations. It helps us to put an occurrence in context of the airline operation and where that fits into the national risk footprint. This is true of both the accident investigation and the more common internal airline safety investigation, which comes often from a disclosure report or data collection. And in many ways new to the company now, and the company investigation is the opportunity where they could fuse the report and the recorded data internally. But with all this data knowledge comes a responsibility that the volunteered information and the very sensitive recorded data is not misused, putting the airline or the individual in greater peril than silence would have. Very real, considering the legal view that we had on an earlier panel. This also creates some interesting situations for oversight to ensure that the non-punitive intent of these programs is complied with. Additionally, confidentiality considerations can get very difficult with activities such as data streaming live from the aircraft to the manufacturer and then subsequently used in investigations. Collected and reported data also makes the investigation more complex as we search for context and organizational mitigations, not simply compliance and blame. And how do we control the confidentiality and trust that should come with voluntary disclosure and data recording when we're looking at it forensically? Not to mention the difficulty of international accident investigations where Annex 19 concepts are interpreted differently by different organizations and the protections of the data are remarkably different. With all that in mind, I'll ask my first panel member, Captain Brian Crawford, to share his thoughts.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here and Appreciative for the opportunity. As an operator, I wanted to have a conversation about investigation and data and just culture and all the things we've been talking about today from sort of a conceptual and maybe cultural standpoint. One of the reasons I think that's important is I think as an organization, no matter which one it is, we behave the way we think about things. And so I want to talk today about using data to think about how it is that an organization thinks about what it does. So I have a picture behind me there. That's an EMB 145 on the way back from Brazil, a brand new EMB 145 on the way back from Brazil. And I'll use it to represent my air carrier. So we're a super regional, about 800,000 departures a year. So that's 800,000 times where something might go wrong, 404 airplanes. And of course, we're a result of a merger with each side steeped in its own tradition and the whole regional industry steeped in its traditions. So when you look at 800,000, that's a pretty big number. And you have to ask yourself, certainly in 800,000 opportunities, something is an opportunity to do better. And if you believe that nothing went wrong in 800,000 flights, then everything's fine. But if you think that there might be some room for improvement, then I suspect at the end of the day, what matters most out of all of this is that we make some generative, positive change to that air operation. So with that in mind, we talk about understanding our air operation or an air operation, and we use data to do that. Of course, there's tons of data. We have 5 ASAP programs that give us roughly 7,500 ASAP reports a year. We have a FOCA program that gives us roughly 300,000 flight segments to measure every year. There are 2 FRMPs that we have in place that are about 1,000 reports a year and probably more now that 117 is in place by the time we aggregate for the end of 2014. We got, that may be a little difficult to see, mandatory reporting, 15,000 reports a year. We did a LOSA, that's a deep dive for our normal ops, even though there's only one of those. Then we have all of our compliance structure, so that's all the conversation going on between the CMU and the certificate. It's the DoD audit and all of our major partners and their audits and the IOSA audit. We have our internal programs, so we have CAS and we have IEP and we have AQP and we have our reliability programs. You guys are getting the point. Lastly, there's the industry information that comes in place. So that's ASIAS and CAST and ASRS and ATSAP, a whole host of acronyms. The point of all that is that in the information we collect, there is a sea of data. And of course, some smart folks always said that without data, all you have is opinions. So it's certainly valuable to have a bunch of information. But the flip side of that coin is that at some point, you end up data rich and potentially Int'l poor. And by the way, you know how many pictures you have to take to catch a thunderstorm and actual lightning? It's like a 100-to-1 ratio. It's pretty difficult to catch, so I'm glad I have that one there. So data rich and Int'l poor. We have a mountain of information, and of course you know in there somewhere are the answers to all of your problems, and of course there are probably the answers to problems you don't even know you have yet. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do with all that information? We sit on a pile of it, and if we don't look at it proactively, if we don't look at it carefully, we end up in the same boat we've always been in, which is to have a bad outcome and then begin a reactive safety process. Only now we have all these programs that collect a bunch more information. So I would suggest that when you have all these data streams, it's what you do about it that makes the most sense. And I would also purport that what you do about the information you have is a function of the way you think about it. So we do root cause analysis, we do HFACs, assessments of all of the events, all of the reports that we get in. When there's a negative outcome, we do an after-action review. Our investigators in ASAP and for the FOCA management team come up with deep dives and give us recommendations. We have working groups. At the end of the day, there's also the information that exists outside just our company, right? After all, there's nothing new under the sun. A lot of the answers to the questions we may have are probably existing in academia. Point is, once you have all this information and you want to do something with it, I would suggest that one of the positive things you might do is synthesize it. Which is to say, if you see a trend or a concern or have a hypothesis about something that you see in one place, you probably have a bunch of other opportunities to go validate that theory in the existing information that you have. One might take from a single investigation the potential that what was known in one event may be generic to the entire system. You wouldn't know unless you took a look at the data and saw how the synthesis worked. And when you're doing that, I would say that how you look at things, how you look at all that data and what you make of the synthesis is probably a function of what you believe. So I will stick the sort of famous dual versus single loop slide up there, and a little laser probably won't work behind me, but if you take a look at the single loop where we have actions and the results we measure where there's a gap, one might go back and take action based on the outcomes that they see. Or, taking a look at assumptions, which is the top block there, you might change the way you think about what's going on. So there are tons of examples of this in aviation, right? So if we go back to an earlier time pre-CRM, it was presumed that the captain was God, and that whatever he or she said was the story, and the crew was to mind that as if it were the law of the land. Well, then we had this big accident in Tenerife, and we took some time in our industry to recognize that that may not be true. We were talking earlier, just a minute ago, Nick was mentioning that there were the bad old days of a punished pilot or a punished practitioner is a safer practitioner. We have an opportunity when we look at all this information that we have to question some of those things. Certainly prior to 117 in the industry, there was a feeling that if it was legal from a flight and duty time standpoint, it was probably safe. We're starting to recognize now that that may not necessarily be the case. Certainly the one that I'm most personally involved with is the one that says when the rules were written to prevent this very outcome, by choosing not to abide by that rule, we were accepting the risk of the outcome to begin with. When I wrote the manual for a time, that was sort of my famous phrase, and it took me some time in my dual loop learning to get to my assumption that perhaps it doesn't work that way. And then, of course, when you have these large organizational level investigations, the question you might ask is, do we put a fix in place at the organizational level, or do we put a fix in place at the person level? So I would say, as you go around this dual loop as an organization, my experience, our experience has been that this goes, the way you think about things goes in a sort of order of maturity. So first, prior to having exposure to a ton of data, you might say, well, everything is fine except for those bad outcomes. So I'm going to identify those bad outcomes, find the actor, and punish them, and then we'll go back to everything is fine. And after you do that for a little while, you might get to a slightly refined point of view on that, is that everything is fine except for the outcomes, and now that we're measuring some things that didn't drive outcomes, all the undesired events. And how you think about that is probably a function of what it is you're going to do about it. And with a little bit more experience, you might say that understanding the system behavior is what you might glean from all the information that you collect. And then lastly, you can get to, hey, the things that we are seeing in an ultra-safe, very robust system now are the results of normal people doing normal work on a normal day. So I'll do a little comparison contrast. By looking at things tactically, you probably end up making short-term change, treating the symptom, chasing the data that you see in a reactive way with tactical fixes. But with a little bit of maturity and some dual loop learning, you might have an opportunity for long-term change, treating the disease rather than the symptom. Use investigation as your guide and use the data to validate what it is that you purport to have happen. That allows you to be proactive and predictive. And there you might get to some strategic, comprehensive solutions. And so I would suggest that at the end of the day, what matters most is what you take from this mountain of data that we've collected. And if you can do something with that data to make a change in the organization, in the way the organization thinks about what it does, you have an opportunity to make a change in the way the organization and the people in it behave. And in turn, you can get back to the very tenets of just culture to begin with, which is if you're going to share some important information, we probably ought to do something important with that information as well. So I have a couple examples, but I think maybe we can talk about that later if there's some questions.
Thank you, Brian. Dana, your comments?
Thank you. So I guess I'm probably one of the most reactive people on the panel, being with the NTSB. But I would like to say that I think our mission is proactive. We just do it through a reactive process, accident investigation. And I think I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the collaborative efforts between the NTSB's work and the industry, specifically with regard to data and proactive systems, because I think in the case of accident investigation, I can really see two roles where reactive data can actually help improve proactive programs. First of all, by providing accident investigation data to the proactive programs, I think it helps set a better understanding of cause-effect relationships that might not necessarily have been understood when data collection efforts were undertaken, when, whether we're talking about CAS metrics or we're talking about other data collection activities that at the operational level you might be doing day to day in your company. Sometimes an accident can reveal these cause-effect relationships with hazards that weren't really understood before. And so that's one value added I think that accident investigation can provide. We can provide that data to organizations like ASIAS, and with our MOU now we have a vehicle to do that. The second area is that, and I think this is a really critical and important aspect of accident investigation, how it can improve the proactive programs, is being able to get information to help assess the effectiveness of safety enhancements. CAS ASIAS has done an awful lot of work to develop these different enhancements with the notion that the industry knows how to perhaps put actions in place to mitigate risk. But sometimes they don't work the way you thought they would. And that can be because the plan itself might have a vulnerability that wasn't anticipated, or it could be that people out there on the line every day aren't following the plan. And that could be because they don't understand the plan, or they don't understand the value of their actions to the plan. And so accident investigation, whether you're talking about from the NTSB standpoint or you're talking about within your own organization through ASAP and those other activities that you do, is really critical to get to the heart of that. Do I have training issues? What is the heart of my non-compliance issues if that's the problem? And the accident investigation data, I think, can really serve to help the proactive safety programs in that regard. Because in any investigation, you can take a look at, were safety enhancements implemented? And if they were they effective here? And if they weren't, why weren't they? And that's something for us at the NTSB, having a better connection with CAS ASIAS has helped us over the last few years, and particularly, I think in the recent time, to be able to understand what enhancements are out there so that we can use that knowledge as part of our investigative process through our parties, that we can start understanding. We know what enhancements were put in place, and we can look closer at those aspects of the investigation. So for us, it can help us collect better data that you can use in your proactive systems. I'd also like to say that on the proactive data side, you all can help us as well. And I was going to talk a little bit about our MOU with ASIAS and how that we envisioned that helping us out. But in a nutshell, I think Paul Morrell mentioned it in the prior panel, that it really will help us devise more focused, targeted recommendations to get to the at-risk population more quickly. We all know we have limited resources, and so setting priorities is critical to safety. And what we don't want to do is have divergent priorities to the extent that there are common pieces of, common root causes, if you will. We want to make sure we're all moving in the same direction. However, sometimes accidents are that unfortunate bump that we need to help us understand that what we thought was cause-effect isn't really. And so we do need to rethink, and that might mean we as an agency at the NTSB need to write a safety recommendation to say, hey, we know you were looking in this direction, but you might want to go look over here. But working together collaboratively through the ASIAS MOU, for example, I think we'll get there, and I think we'll get there faster as a community for safety. So I think what I would like to suggest is it's not one versus the other with proactive and reactive, but they're complementary. They really should be working together in the interest of safety. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the NTSB ASIAS MOU. It was signed in November of 2012, And since then, we've done 2 tabletop exercises. We just finished up one last year. And unfortunately, we are exercising the MOU for real for the first time on the UPS 1354 accident. But on the flip side, it's unfortunate that the accident occurred, but the interaction that we've been able to have with the ASIAS organization to be able to try to understand how this de-identified aggregated information can help us better focus our recommendations, I think is going to be invaluable. And I'm happy to say that we're very close to a working group activity, which is the latter part of the MOU. But for us at NTSB, one of the most important aspects of the MOU has been building on this idea that I think you've all talked about today, the just culture, is maintaining trust. What we don't want to see happen is these programs go away. They, I think, have been instrumental in the safety record that we've seen in the U.S. and perhaps hopefully around the world as these programs take heart and really become ingrained in the culture of organizations. And so everything we do in our interaction is intended to preserve that, that trust. And to that extent, I think we internally within NTSB have a process that we set up to make sure that requests for ASIAS information are really vetted through the highest levels of our organization. One practical matter that really has to be addressed in that regard is the time it takes the ASIAS organization to do a data study for us. Anybody that's, as an organization, airlines, manufacturers, you have your data sets. We've talked about big data earlier. It is big data. It's a lot of information, and it can take a long time to really sort through that, create unique specialized algorithms that are needed for a precise, specific, single data point accident. And you do have to stop and ask yourself the question, where's the value added? And while I think that no matter what, there's going to be value added using that information, the one thing that we're very cautious of is to not throw a one-size-fits-all approach on it either. For example, I think a lot of people have a tendency to think that the FOQA information is going to be the most useful because it's quantitative data and it's, pardon the phrase, it's sexy. You can make charts, you can make graphs, but to be honest, we're very excited to see how the de-identified aggregated information from ASAP can be used. That's really getting at the perspective of the crew, or whether you're talking about the flight crew, the cabin crew, the maintenance crew, to really understand more about what may have impacted their decisions, and ultimately get to understand the nature of an accident and the causes of an accident. So having all of that information together as part of the ASIAS MOU is very exciting. And I think it's going to be very valuable both to the reactive NTSB type investigative process, but also the proactive process of FOQA and ASAP and all of the SMS tools that are being used. So I guess in closing, I would say that I think we need to look at this as a 360-degree circle, a collaboration between reactive and proactive. They feed off of each other. And I think that the reactive data can help you understand the effectiveness of your proactive systems. Because if you want to think of it as a quality escape, when an accident happens, it got through the safety management system. Now we need to feed that data back into the process. And we shouldn't ever be, we need to be very careful that we really look at that information both quantitatively and qualitatively with experts to understand what it means. So,
thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Terry, your comments from your perspective?
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Sean, for inviting me to participate. Certainly a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the rest of the ALPA team for putting this on. I was sitting in the back of the room here today, and I was doing a little reflecting about this whole discussion we're having today, and I thought to myself, man, you've been talking about this stuff for a long time. And then I looked down at the other end of the table, and there was a gentleman sitting down there whose hair was a little bit grayer and probably had a little less of it, but his name's Don McClure. Is he still here? And I just want to recognize Don because Don is really the reason we're all here today. I remember back in like 1991 or 92, Don came into a safety meeting we were having in Pittsburgh at US Airways and talking about, he brought some guy from British Airways that wanted to talk about FOQA and putting recorders on our airplanes so we could analyze it for safety purposes. And I remember sitting there in the room going, who is this guy and what has he been smoking? I mean, it was just like, this is too weird. Never will this ever happen and be successful. And then a couple years later, Don comes in and starts talking to us about this program where we would actually write on paper the errors that we experienced during our operations and turn it into the company and have the company and the FAA look at it. And I said, not in my lifetime. Will that ever happen? You'll never see me do that. Well, I got to know Don a little bit better and spent a lot of time with Don and had a lot of conversations. And he's always a great visionary when it came to this information and utilizing safety information in a very proactive way. He and I always didn't agree with everything, so we had a lot of late night gnashing of teeth and maybe even a few chairs get thrown. But at the end of the day, he had me won over, and I was very proud to be one of the signers on the very first ASAP program that had been approved by the FAA back in the late 90s on behalf of the Airline Pilots Association at US Airways. If Don's not here, let's all at least give him a round of applause for his vision. We've heard a lot today, and it's always kind of tough being on one of the last panels because you don't want to keep saying the same things that have been going on all day. But certainly we've talked a lot about the importance of a proactive use of data. As Dana pointed out, we're talking a lot about big data, and there's so much of it out there. And if there's one thing I learned from Don is don't ever let the data just go into a black hole. You really have to be utilizing that data and giving feedback to the people that are providing the data, because that's what really makes a program very robust. From the manufacturer standpoint, there's kind of three areas that kind of impact us when it comes to data with regards to accidents. Certainly the first area is in those first few hours or first few days after an accident occurs, there's just a real thirst for information, and it's kind of symbolic that I'm sitting between the NTSB and the FAA because both sides are calling us wanting all kinds of information. Certainly we want to be sensitive to the FAA's concerns over continued airworthiness, so we want to make sure they get information, and obviously we want to support the accident investigation as well. And unfortunately, there hasn't always been a real good process defined on how we do that to make sure that we're not getting sideways with the investigation and with the FAA and everything. So I'm very glad the recent summits you had to kind of work out some of those details. I think that was very important because it helped put some processes into place. And certainly we at Boeing, being a bunch of engineers, love processes. So it was good to have some of that, and so that we can continue to document that process so that we can keep track of what the requests are. We can track those requests. We can ensure that the data is getting to the right people at the right time and enhance both the investigation as well as that need for and continuing airworthiness of the fleets. The other part, when it comes to data and accidents, and Ken Quinn really talked to us all about that earlier this morning, and so I'm not going to go into a lot about that, but that's really that post-investigation phase when it comes to litigation. And there's the manufacturers, we're the deep pockets, so we are very, very quickly put in a position of people wanting a lot of information, or there being a lot of information out there, so we want to make sure that certainly that we have access to that information like other people do when it comes to defending ourselves, or at least looking at what needs to be accomplished in the future to help improve safety. So that's another area of data that we're certainly cognizant of as a manufacturer. And then the other part is really the most important part is, okay, what do we learn from the data that we get from these investigations? We always tend to really focus on that probable cause statement and what kind of data we can utilize to react to that probable cause statement. And we sometimes forget about those contributing factors. And if you really want to get to the meat of being proactive based on an accident investigation, I would submit that there's a lot of places where we can utilize data to help us really address some of those contributing factors that come out of a NTSB report, because those are just as important as that probable cause. And finally, I think, and we've heard a lot about it today, and certainly Jay talked about it and Paul talked about it in the previous panel, but how do we really take the information that we're learning from accidents and share it with other parts of the world? We enjoy a tremendously safe environment here in the U.S. and North America and Europe, but not every place around the world shares that same low accident rate. And we continue to make progress here, but as we're making progress, we're learning an awful lot, and there's other regions of the world that can share from that knowledge that we already have. We know what causes a lot of those accidents that are happening in other parts of the world. So the more that we can share that information, and we're doing some great things with the RASPA PA, and now more recently in Southeast Asia with some of the data sharing, and that's where we can really build on the successes that we're having here in the U.S. in terms of getting that word out and helping us reduce the accident rate all over the world, because we live in a very global economy today.
Thank you, Terry. And Jeff, your comments today.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to join part of the conversation. I took a look at the way this particular panel was set up, and it said proactive versus reactive. And I think from my standpoint, I would kind of echo what Dana said. I don't think it's one versus the other. I think it's really proactive and reactive for the benefit of how it helps us advance our understanding, our knowledge, and how that we then roll that back into practices. And I think we would certainly prefer to spend more of our time on the proactive side. When we're in the reactive mode, that's not a good position for anybody to be, and certainly those that were more directly affected by the event. But I really think aviation has been a model for so many industries to be able to have that continual learning. And when I say the learning, it's really the life cycle. We think the best way to position ourselves for a successful operation is to have the right standards, the right kind of involvement in approving the products up front. It's what we call our proactive continued operational safety, making sure that the product is ready for operation, it's had the right kind of review, the right kinds of standards applied. And once the product gets into service, then following how it's doing in our continued operational safety activity, again, primarily with a proactive focus, but at times a reactive component as well. But gathering whatever we can from those operations, those events, those learnings, to see where we may need to make adjustments in terms of our standards, our practices, our kind of involvement, maybe where we had the wrong assumptions in advance of approving the product, and then driving those back into adjustments in the standards so that they can be positioned and hopefully responsive to the directions that industry will be going in the future. So to me, it's really a complement. It's proactive and reactive for the benefit of continual learning. I think we've had opportunities to improve in both arenas over the last 10 to 15 years. Terry mentioned some of the things that have come from the recent summit that the NTSB hosted, and I think even some of the recent investigations that we've had the opportunity to be involved with have provided insights, I think, for both organizations, or all of the organizations, to better understand our respective roles, to understand how those can be done in a more collaborative fashion, to have deeper insight on what some of the considerations and assumptions might be. And so I think that's really valuable, that we take the opportunity when those events come along and not only mechanically get through the process, but use it as an opportunity to better understand our respective roles. On the proactive side, I think the work that has been going on widely within industry and also within the FAA has been very positive, I think, in terms of showing continued safety improvements. And more effective ways on how we meet our safety objectives. Within the FAA, over the last several years, we have put in place more structured processes on how we accomplish our continued operational safety role, more structured processes in terms of how we do our risk assessments. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we always come to the same conclusions, but I think by taking those steps, we're able to function more consistently. And I think when we do come to different conclusions, whether that be internally in terms of making key safety decisions, or when we're working with an individual manufacturer or the broader industry, we can be more objective about what led us to those different conclusions. Was it different degrees of conservatism? Was it different assumptions? Was it different methodologies? And so I think these are just natural steps that I think show the desire to be more consistent, to be more evolutionary, to continue to drive the learning back into the practices that we use day in and day out. So from the regulator standpoint, by necessity, we live in both worlds, both the proactive and the reactive. The desire is to continue to make the progress and to be able to have more opportunities on the proactive side, but when those situations arise, try to embrace the reactive events from the opportunity to learn, to take the opportunity to communicate, to coordinate, to collaborate, those things that are key to any kind of a successful project outcome. Nobody planned the event, but hopefully when they occur, we can all walk away from it with an opportunity to see how we continue to evolve the standards for the improvement of the future. So a few thoughts, I guess more of a collaborative approach there, Nick, in terms of how they are both important components.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jeff. And Chuck, your thoughts on reactive and proactive investigations?
Well, I'm the dreaded last panelist on the last panel, so some would say I have the final word. Everybody else has taken all my jokes and funny comments, so I can't do that anymore. I think part of what we need to think about, both in a just culture and what we are now evolving into from a safety management standpoint, is to help get us moving forward and looking at this. I think it is useful sometimes to think about what it was like, and certainly at the beginning of my career, what this all looked like. And, as Terry mentioned, we have been talking about a lot of these concepts for a long period of time, but we need to do that to keep it moving positive. I mean, certainly in the last 35 years, we have learned a great deal about aircraft design. Wind shear was just starting to come into our vocabulary, but then we learned about microburst. We're talking about aircraft upsets, phraseology issues, excuse me, certainly about fatigue and things like that, and situational awareness, particularly with closeness to terrain. And if you go back 35 years, you'll take a seminal event, in my view, which was TWA 514, controlled flight into terrain just west of Dulles Airport. They were executing a VOR DME approach to runway 12, descended early, and impacted the terrain 20 miles northwest of the airport. And if you take a look at the NTSB report on that accident, and Dana, I have to tell you, that was written on a manual typewriter. I mean, I do not know how they did that, but if you read that report, you will see the NTSB interviewed pilots, controllers, and there was such a misunderstanding on what cleared for the approach meant, both in a lateral sense and in a vertical sense. And today, we couldn't live with ourselves knowing that there was that kind of issue out there, that kind of misunderstanding out there. And I think that's the kind of thing that inspires all of us to say we have come a long ways. I mean, as our approach to error management, for example, we used to have error management as being, we've got to totally reduce it to zero. We can't tolerate errors. And I think through our accident investigation processes that the airlines have looked at, 30 years of CRM, I think we look now as, yes, prevention of errors is important. You can mitigate that by proper training, the proper environment, the proper aircraft design. But that we have to acknowledge that as long as humans are involved, we're going to make mistakes. And the only way we're going to learn from those mistakes is to be able to report them, to admit to them, and take action to trap them in the future. And, you know, I think CRM has done a lot for us in that regard. You know, I was looking at my watch this morning and I was asking myself, you know, when are we going to hear the first reference to the get out of jail free card this morning? And it was, I think it was 40 minutes into the symposium. You know, and certainly as one who works with pilots in a pilot association, and we have other pilot associations here in the audience today, and I think we're in agreement on that. The idea of the out of jail free card, you know, is a total mischaracterization for the pilot community. We do understand the responsibility. We do understand that just culture doesn't mean free of accountability. And, you know, the thing that I've heard, and I've heard from some of the other panelists, is not only do you have to collect the data, but you got to do something with it. And as pilots, we want to be part of the solution. And I think certainly as we are looking over accident reports, and we are learning from those, we've finally moved away from using the burning holes in the ground as being the way we train ourselves. We are taking a more of a proactive approach. And we certainly want to be part of that solution. And so, you know, I take exception to the characterization that we only want to provide the data because it's the out of jail free card. You know, and I think Dana would agree with this as well, you know, when accidents happen, things get done. And certainly as we look at the tragedy in Buffalo 5.5 years ago, I take a look at what has changed. And as Dana characterized, the reactive approach, you know, that the NTSB takes with their work. But I look at the mountains that have moved in the last 5.5 years in the regulatory world. Certainly, you know, with guidance out there, our total approach towards fatigue. And I think what we need to take from that is we don't have to wait for the accident for that to happen. We can take a forensic approach today. There are, you know, we have those near misses. Or things where, you know, we say we dodged a bullet. And we can use our a proactive approach towards identifying really what those threats are and conduct our own internal investigations long before, you know, as we say, we bend the metal. And I think that's part of the approach that we have to take. I think we have to look at how far we've come and then give ourselves the goal, how far do we want to go from today in the future in achieving, you know, that goal that you heard the administrator and the associate administrator mention this morning of really addressing the safety risks that are out there.
Thank you, Chuck. An interesting look at investigations proactively before the product is even out, and reactively, as Dana said. And I can only hope now that we have some questions from the audience so that I don't have to craft up clever questions from this chair. Perhaps, Chad, have you got anything texting? I guess not.
We do have one that's come
there we
in.
go.
Under SMS and various other voluntary programs, this data that's collected, either from the manufacturer or from the airline, is typically proprietary and protected. How can an investigative agency protect that data?
Who wants to take that one on?
Well, I guess I can start. We deal with that all of the time. As Terry knows, we often are working with proprietary information related to the design of the aircraft, let's say. And we do, in the United States, at the NTSB, under our enabling statute, we do have trade secret protection. So we are able to protect that information. And there are times, though, when to explain and really detail the root cause of the accident, that some level of information needs to be provided to the public. And so that's where it's very important to have that collaboration with the parties, with the manufacturers, with the operators, to make sure that we can provide enough substance to tell the story about what happened and why, but not so much that, trade secrets are released that are going to do harm to a company, because that really doesn't help anybody, no matter who you're talking about. We also have provisions in our statute for the protection of voluntarily provided safety data. And so there's, some opportunity as well in the process of doing investigative work to have others not involved in the investigation share information. And we have the ability to protect that as well. So we have some protections. I think the approach we've taken with the SIAS is it's de-identified, aggregated information. Our purpose for getting that information is not to look at the individual pilot. That really doesn't do us any good. Our purpose is to really look at the whole system and to understand what's the breadth of the problem. And that's what that type of information provides us. So I think there's ample opportunity to use information under SMS that's produced by SMS without violating the trust, but still being able to accomplish the objective of identifying the cause of accidents and putting effective corrective actions in place through either NTSB safety recommendations or as part of the CAST-SIAS process through safety enhancements.
And as manufacturers, as Dana said, we sign proprietary agreement arrangements with both FAA and NTSB as part of either an investigation, a certification project, whatever it may be. So we do share information under those protective provisions, and then they can protect it under the things they have in place. So.
From the FAA side, we've got agreements with the major manufacturers, and the vast majority of the very useful data that comes in is already de-identified. And the part of the work that we're doing is looking at the product, not so much oversight of the particular operator. So, I think it certainly serves our need to understand how the product performed. Was there something that could be done to enhance its performance? Did we miss something in our earlier review or have a wrong assumption? So the vast majority of that information that comes in now, it's not under a formal SMS program, but I think it certainly meets many of the tenets of what people would consider to be a good SMS practice. I think there are opportunities to probably evolve it beyond what we do today, but the issue of de-identification is very much the norm for the vast majority of the information that we're working with.
Chuck, your eyes?
Yeah, just to go back to the NTSB SIAS MOU, I think I agree with Dana. I think this is a big deal, and I think it's good in both directions. In that, I think those of us that participate in the SIAS see the value in the NTSB gleaning information that they might not otherwise have. But there's also another side where the NTSB is also sharing information with the SIAS, and I think that's a very, very positive relationship. The MOU that we have in place now between SIAS and NTSB, as you heard, it's been a while. It's been a very, very slow, deliberate process. We've had a couple of tabletops, and as Dana alluded to, sadly, we actually have an event that we're testing the MOU with. But I think it needs to be a slow process. I think we have to take baby steps with this, because I think it's a large step. And I think that speaks to the importance of protecting the data. This is not just something you would want to sign on a Friday night and put into place the following Monday. I think because of the sensitivity of the information that's being exchanged both ways, that it does need to be a slow and deliberate process. And I think we have to adhere to the gates that we've put into place, the review gates, to see how that MOU is performing.
This conversation was sort of about national data with the size and things like that. I'm curious, I don't really know how to phrase the question, but to discuss the proactive collection of data inside an airline and they have an accident, NTSB comes along. Now you're going to be analyzing every manual they have and all of their procedures and policies. How do you address finding out that although they may have checked off the boxes and they appear to be collecting good data, they really aren't doing much with it? Is that something that you would be able to address in an investigation, an inadequacy in the airline on that level? I'm actually venturing this to you, Dana.
Yeah, I think that, you know, each investigation, depending on the circumstances, we're going to look at different pieces of evidence, if you will, to understand cause. Clearly, in a general sense, we're always looking for information that can get us there, and oftentimes that might be to understand, you know, in order to understand issues like culture, might require, you know, that type of information. But we're certainly not, we're not an organization that's set up to audit or to judge, you know, to, I guess I'll say, compare against a reference measure. So oftentimes what we will do is use the data that we do have available to us, which is interviews with you know, people involved in the accident, with the training organization, with the oversight organization within the company, and make recommendations that maybe the FAA look to do a more enhanced audit or something of that nature. But see, this is where having that bigger set of information is really helpful, because I think in a general sense, some issues, you know, understanding the breadth of them can get you there. And, you know, each case is going to be unique and different, but yeah, we oftentimes when we go into an investigation, we want to understand, has this happened before? Not so much because we're looking to, again, place blame. That's not the purpose of our investigation. It's to get to root cause and and try to affect safety action. But again, is to try to help the bigger community understand, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And what are the factors? And as Terry said, what are the contributing factors, not just those primary factors? So that information locally gets you so far, but having a broader context of information really gets you to that next level, and that's what we're looking for through our relationship with the ASIS organization.
Okay, I think we do have a question. I'm reading it right? Yep, there we go.
I'm Jim McKenna. I'll leave it to all y'all to decide what it says about my judgment that I stand up and ask maybe the last question of the last panel. I'm going to try and string together some threads here, so bear with me. Terry, thank you for reminding us all about Don McClure. I got involved in this community in large part because I ran into him in 1994 or so. Kevin reminded us earlier, you know, we've been talking about CAST and ASIS, but this is an international issue that the international community is addressing. Ken Quinn made a point of noting that the CIA can't tell its good stories, but we do a bad job of telling our good stories, and there are a lot of them. I forget which of you made the point of saying that we should not forget to look at the contributing causes of an accident's findings. So my question is, given the dilemma of selling the good story about what has been going on in this industry for the last 10 or 15 years, does the U.S. need to drop probable cause and move to the international standard of listing the causes without emphasizing one or the other? The reason I ask is because, like it or not, most people in the U.S. find out about the cause, the determinations about an accident through the media after the NTSB stands up and says the probable cause of this accident was. And that's not where this effort is, and that's not where you all are focused on. You're looking at finding the problems before they bend the metal, and it's the link that you're trying to break rather than the smoking gun that outside of the U.S. and a few other countries isn't really the focus of safety investigations. So do we need to get rid of probable cause?
You willing to tackle that one?
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it first. speaking for myself, not for the NTSB, I guess, because I haven't talked to the powers that be there about this one, but I would submit that you're very correct about the comment about the media today. However, in this country, and I think every state under the ICAO framework has to consider the country and the laws of that country that they're operating in or that they are in. If you leave a vacuum, the media will fill it. And so my sense is that if we did steer away from probable cause, it's very likely that there wouldn't be a resolution of, let's say, of a quality that the public really needs, you know, in a sense. So while I think what the other ICAO states are doing is great, it is targeted towards every safety deficiency that's identified in the investigation, and we certainly want all of our data treated the same way. If we have a contributing cause, we have findings in our investigative reports. Those have merit. They absolutely do. If they didn't, we wouldn't be making recommendations attached to those, and we do. But if you do leave a void, it will get filled by someone, and you got to ask yourself the question, who do you want that to be? Do you want it to be the media, or do you want, you know, and not to, you know, down the media side of it, they do have an important role to play in this country, and they do, and I think what we do helps direct that that final outcome. And, you know, and unfortunately, you know, it's just the way of things today, the communication and information flow with all the social media. I just think that the outcomes might not be as precise and bright line if that goes away, if probable cause goes away, so.
Like Dana, I probably have some personal opinions on it, but I'll be careful so I don't get in trouble with the Home Office. But regardless of what the system is, as safety professionals, I think we have the obligation to, when a report comes out, to dig deeper and look into analyzing it than just looking at the single probable cause. It's too easy to look at the probable cause. I used to tell the story, look at the probable cause and go, my guys would have never done that, and put the report away. And that's not doing the due diligence that we as safety professionals need to do. We need to at least take a look at all those contributing factors, and then what data is out there that can help us address some of those contributing factors and really delve into the whole report in its entirety. If we're not doing that, it really doesn't matter what kind of report it is. We're not really analyzing the report in its entirety. We're not doing ourselves as and the industry a favor.
Chuck, do you have anything to add? Or?
No, you know, I'm in agreement with that. I think we've learned the most in the years past by looking at all the causal factors. And I certainly understand the single probable cause motivation, but you know, I think I'd like to believe that we're at the dawn to where we can list all of the risks, and look at a variety of recommendations that come out of a report, and look at it from multiple perspectives, which I think we obviously have to do, particularly in a just culture.
Thank you. Chad signaled me that he has somebody who's watching us on webcam with a text, and then we'll get to the next question in the aisleway.
Yeah, continuing on in that, the thread of the international ideas, we've heard from the NTSB how they value the data and they're working with stakeholders to ensure its proper use. Do the panelists have a sense of how other investigative agencies treat that data?
Once again, one of you want to volunteer for this?
Me?
Sure.
Well, I know talking with our Canadian counterparts, you know, I've had some less formal communications with them on the topic, but I think it is a broad spectrum out there. Obviously, some states require certain types of data to be collected that's considered voluntary in this country, so they may have provisions that are actually even more rigorous for protecting the information. And I couldn't get into too many specifics, but I know that ICAO has efforts underway to look at data protection, the Annex 19 discussion and so forth. So I think the good news is that for as far as we've come here, the international community is right there with us. So it's continuing to come along, but staying engaged in the conversation, particularly the U.S. in the ICAO framework, is really important, I think, to continue to make sure that the information is used correctly and continues to benefit safety.
And I've been on a working group with ICAO, and there's definitely the effort to get that language just right and get it where we need it in Annex 19 and others. Question in the aisleway?
Yeah, I'll try to make this brief. As the world gets safer and safer, we have less and less fatal accidents to investigate. And recently, I think the NTSB has done a lot to try to assert its authority into investigating incidents. And just to give Dana maybe a rest, maybe the others on the panel can say, are there some specific factors that you think lead naturally to where we should have the NTSB involved in doing incident investigations? And, what's your perspective on that?
Chuck Lillard.
I'll take a stab at that, Mark.
Do you want to?
I see where you're going with that, and I see the logic in that. I think for the health of the industry, I think we need to refine our internal processes and the things that we're doing well right now that we want to build on. Certainly, the NTSB has a number of assets in this that could be employed, and I think that would be a good place to start. I think, in fact, some of what we've signed with the NTSB MOU might be a thread. Hear Dana's perspective on this, but it might be a thread towards that. But I think as an industry, we want to look within ourselves and say that this is part of our responsibility, is to really tease out the causes of some significant incidents. As we learn in CRM, we want to use all available resources. Certainly the NTSB's got some good resources on that.
Brian. Oh, sorry, Terry.
It's the National Transportation Safety Board, not the National Transportation Accident Investigation Board. So I think finding those places where we can collaborate as an industry with all the available parties, I think is in general a good thing. But again, it has to come down to, what is the right way to do it? What is the right agreements to have, and make sure it's a very, good defined process. But, again, we need all the help and safety we can.
Brian, you may have a few comments on that as well, and perhaps you can elaborate with some of your company investigations and how that might help or not help.
Absolutely. So, I tend to agree that it's the organization's responsibility to investigate its own performance and its own behavior. And generally, if you have the systems in place right, you're in the best position to look internally. But there are examples of times when some of the factors are further afield. So just recently there was the near midair in Newark. You guys may remember an ExpressJet 145 and a United Airbus. And of course, we had an opportunity to take a look internally at all the factors that were in play for our portion, but there was certainly an ATC factor there as well. And there are times when it is helpful to have a mediator in between those parties to take care of that. So I'm sort of of two minds. One, certainly it's our responsibility to have an idea of what we're doing internally and to kind of be out ahead of the game enough to be able to say, well, that risk was in place and we understood that was there and we had managed it to the lowest level we thought we reasonably could. But then there are times when it's an interfaced and a nuanced sort of thing. So I hate to say yes and no all at the same time, but I do think that there's a lot of value in doing so under the right circumstances with the right agreements in place.
Thank you. And is there somebody in the hall? Yep, there we go. Another question from the alleyway?
Actually, Skip Sampson, and I'd like to just carry this discussion just a little bit further. kind of from a different angle of what we've talked about with the NTSB SIS MOU, but looking at specific events that we may, in the ASAP world as an ERC, we're investigating an event that may now also be an NTSB. It could be an accident or maybe just a reportable incident. And now the NTSB is becoming involved. I mean, you even mentioned, Brian, your event there. How does that change the role of the ERC, or how does the ERC work within that context? Because we know we have the party system, and the ERC is best locally sometimes to deal with some of those issues, but we want to be proactive within our own systems, but then we also understand now there's a whole other role coming into play with the NTSB, perhaps being involved in investigation, and that can kind of change the game of the ERC's work, whether the ERC wants to work quickly, but we don't want to work too quickly. And so I don't know if Dana or anybody else would like to address how we might be able to work in that realm.
Keeping you busy.
Sorry. I guess I would say if you want to think of our prime directive, so to speak, it's not to impede safety. Certainly, do no harm first. And to that extent, ASAP programs like that are safety programs, and they have had a great deal of success addressing the local issues. And so we wouldn't want to see that stopped or in any way degraded. And so to that extent, in our investigations, we know that ASAP investigations are going on typically in parallel, and that's okay. We work through our party system with the, let's say, the airline coordinator, party coordinator, to make sure that the needs of the investigation are met, but we respect the fact that there are certain things going on with ERCs. That doesn't mean we're not going to interview the crew. We will, and we'll want to do that sooner than later, because that's really fresh information that's important to get. But it also doesn't mean that we're not respectful of that process. So, we recognize that there's a couple of reasons we ask organizations to join us in the investigation as parties. One is selfish for us, because we need the technical knowledge. We can't know every airplane design. We're not typed on every aircraft and so forth. But the other reason is because as a party, you can make change now. We can't do that. We don't have any authority to make changes to the rules. We don't regulate. We just write recommendations, and you have the power. You can make the change. And so if you're right there with us, finding the issues, you can go at it and make that change. And part of that process, I think, is the ERC. And to the extent that it makes it more structured and more just, bring it on. I think that's great. So we've, I think, been able to work pretty collaboratively with those programs through our investigation. And to my knowledge, I don't think we've seen a negative consequence on our investigation, or hopefully air carriers and manufacturers would say the same.
Any thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I think probably also there's maybe a layer of depth that the ERC might be able to provide that an outsider might not be able to see, in that it is a group of peers operating the same equipment in the same operation. And so to be able to put some decisions or some choices or some behaviors in context is probably super helpful, I'd imagine, into understanding sort of whatever the event is with some depth. So I always like to count on our ERCs for the sort of color commentary, the depth of why they suspect that whoever did or didn't do whatever it was that we're interested in talking about. So to be able to have that conversation, to know that that's going on behind closed doors, I think is super valuable, because it lends context. Context is the thing that allows you to understand the whys and the depth behind the event that you're investigating in the first place. That was my plug for 10 years on the ERC.
And to encourage volunteers to participate in our ERCs.
And it's a wonderful thing to do.
Nick?
Go ahead. Sorry, Jeff.
I was just going to say, I think, a couple of the more recent events have been a good opportunity to do some of that, learning, where you actually see that there are multiple activities going on simultaneously, some maybe at a more rapid pace than others. And I think the conversations that we've been able to have enabled us to better understand how those roles can be supported, and try to do it in a way that's complementary rather than one, superseding the other. And so I think what's going on at the local airline level, what's going on within our operational safety programs and the role of the NTSB. I think the key is, how do we get all of the information, and information will come from different sources, but do it in a way that is respectful of the other processes, do it in a way that is responsive to the timeliness. Some of these fleets now are getting very, very large, and as we learn things, it may be that we need to start moving more quickly than what the investigation itself will be doing. So I think, this is a key area where I think we've been able to make some progress in learning through some of the more recent events, which have been, fortunately through incident kinds of experience as opposed to accident kind of experience.
That's a big advantage of the whole ASAP ERC program, is that we, as I said earlier, we get to investigate it before it's really an accident.
Right.
And that's a gold mine. We have another question in this aisle way over here.
Hi, good afternoon. Rich Huey from FedEx. First, thanks to the panel for your time and effort today, being with us, sharing your thoughts and expertise. Appreciate it a lot. From a holistic view, which I've heard a lot of that word used today, I'd like to get the panel's view on the safety management systems and the whole operation environment that would include cargo.
Chuck, you want to start with that, perhaps?
Well, as you heard this morning, we develop our safety systems without regard to whether we have passengers or cargo in the back of the airplane. Now, flight time, duty time notwithstanding, I think we've done a good job. I think we continue to look at, analyze risks, certainly from the cargo, and certainly your carrier and the safety professionals at your carrier are key, and certainly in ALPA's efforts. But, there is that sore thumb out there, Rich, and you and I have talked about it as far as the flight time, duty time rules and the carve-out that exist for, cargo carriers. But that notwithstanding, I think we have to take I think SMS is just as relevant. I think ASAP and FOQA is just as relevant for cargo operations. There may be different types of threats out there, and there may be different risk assessment models on those threats, but I think the process, in my view, the process has got to be the same.
I agree, and it's interesting. I think cargo often is when the skies are not full of airplanes and there's no witnesses in the back and so on and so forth. So there's even a greater need to have these self-disclosure programs so that what's really going on is made aware to those who can make change. Anybody else want to handle that question?
No, I just jumping in and volunteering Terry for this. They sell airplanes and they want those airplanes operated safely, and they would be happy selling all the future airplanes to cargo operators. It doesn't matter. And I think from that perspective, I think we have to push for exactly the same standards in flying that kind of transport.
Thank you. Violent agreement.
Oh, look at that, 10 minutes to go. So I see a finger pointing that way. Chad, must have a viewer that has a question.
This one didn't come into any specific panel member, so it's kind of addressed to the entire panel. If an airline or a manufacturer implements SMS, i.e. just culture, and it becomes very apparent that they haven't properly implemented, that they're having issues, how does the industry, or how do you go about correcting that?
You want to take a stab at that? Terry?
I don't know that we're necessarily evolved enough to know how to answer your question right now. We're certainly in the midst of developing an SMS, for Boeing, and I know Jeff's been involved with that with us for a couple of years. We still have some work to do. Part of the thing that we certainly look at is what existing processes do we have in place that would be part of an SMS, And when you look at the processes that we have in place, there are a number of them that are ASAP-like or FOQA-like. They're not exactly not the same, but they provide data and information back into our both our design process as well as our changes to our design process, so that we continue to look at the health of the fleet. So that's kind of the focus, but we're utilizing the same 4 pillars as we build this that you do within an operational type of SMS. But we haven't completed that work yet. I think we have a commitment to Jeff to have one here on the table by the end of the year, if I remember right, pretty around there. That's kind of where we're at along in the evolution of SMS from a manufacturer standpoint. It's been a bit of a difficult journey because so much of the tenets behind SMS are very operationally focused. And so to take some of those things and apply them in the manufacturing world it's been difficult, just because we want to make sure that we meet the intent without totally upsetting all of the good processes that we already have in place. So it's been a challenge.
Right?
So I think one of the failure modes, or maybe the failure mode with SMS, a primary one might be that you end up with compliant SMS processes and then you stick it on a shelf in a book and you leave it there and you go about your normal business. And so speaking from sort of an air operator point of view, I think there was, we're in the voluntary program and we're moving our way through exiting level 3 to level 4. And I think we saw the potential that we might be veering a little bit towards processes in a book and not so much changing the way the organization works. Obviously, I'm a big believer in change the way you think, change the way the organization goes. So we put the parking brake on for a minute and are in the middle of sort of an internal reboot so that we'll be able to plug that thing back out where it works the way we intend it to work rather than simply meets the requirements of Part 5. And so I think that because it's so behavioral and it's so performance oriented and it's not really about some prescriptive compliance with some requirements, I think you have to kind of manage it with that as the point of view and do your own self-assessment from there. And that's certainly what we're doing. And we'll end up being a little later to market than we intended to be, but I think it's going to be a worthwhile slowdown in investment. You have to treat it that way, otherwise you end up with a program.
Well, clearly it's not a one-size-fits-all doesn't work. You have to modify it to what you're doing, whether it's manufacturing or operations, large or small. It's not an easy process to get working well. Chuck had some comments. Jeff?
Yeah, Nick, I was just going to say, I think you could look at the industry as a whole, and processes have been developed over time, to individually manage risk or certain bad outcomes, and those have been the building blocks for what we now are trying to bring together in a more complete system that we call a safety management system. I think people have had a lot of different views on exactly what safety management is and how different it is from what they might be familiar with in more localized processes and procedures. But as I think we continue to move from kind of a bottom-up approach to a top-down and to figure out where are there gaps between these individual processes that companies like Boeing and Airbus and GE have done a great job in developing, where are there gaps in the more complete system and what can we do to fill those and make sure that we have the communication that flows across the organization, to validate information, to make sure that those that need to know are informed. I think one of the keys is, and what I say within our organization, because we too are on that journey, is, safety management is not a silver bullet. You can't look at safety management and try to use it as a judgment tool against whether the outcome was good or bad. I think the only thing you can do is look at the organization's commitment, and when bad outcomes happen, and there have been some recently, how does the organization respond? Does it respond in a way that, objectively tries to understand and improve and not indict the people? Or does it do it in the way that we were talking about earlier, which is more maybe akin to that, it's on the bookshelf, but we really haven't changed our behavior. And I've seen a lot of organizations that I try to remind our folks, I think at a very senior level, they are very much committed, but it's going to take time to permeate. Mistakes are going to be made, And we have to be patient and understand that journey because we're on the same journey.
Chuck, you had some comments?
Well, Brian made an excellent point. You know, again, we've evolved over 30 years. I think a lot of us used to believe that you'd reach an end state. I don't think you ever reach an end state in safety management. You measure the success of your SMS by the fact that it is always changing. We learned this in the training world with AQP. You thought you developed an AQP, you put it on the shelf, and there you go. AQP has to be living and breathing for it to be effective and to constantly improve training. And I think SMS definitely has to be the same way.
Thanks, Chuck. I was given the last question call a few moments ago, so if you can keep it brief, we'll take one last one before Sean gets up here and hits me in the back of the head.
Bill Levin, FedEx captain. I'd like to address your FedEx question. And I don't think this just cause can work at FedEx because I can't trust flight management not to use my safety input for disciplinary reasons. It will never work.
And is there a question in that?
No.
Okay. Thank you for your comments. And I'd like to thank the panel very much for joining us today. It's a big chunk of your day to come down here and do this, and really appreciate it. Some people flew from the West Coast, just so we understand how committed they are to helping us get to the non-end goal that we're going to. And with that, there he is.
How about a round of applause for our panel?